I had a railway background, and quite naturally the interest transferred itself to my son, and when he was ill with measles at the age of 3, it was most natural for me to tell him stories about trains. And he said, "Daddy, what are the engine's names?"
That's the way.
And I invented names on the spur of the moment: Edward, Gordon, Henry, and so on. There was Edward's Day Out, Henry in the Tunnel, and then there was another story based on a story I'd read in the magazine about a Highland Railway banker being left behind. This was the story of how Gordon got stuck on the hill and had to be rescued by Edward, the engine whom he despised, banking him in the rear. But once Edward had started him off, Gordon was able to go on fast, and poor Edward ran out of steam and got left behind. And so there it was. And the first book, 3 Railway Engines, was published in 1945.
Hello there, you're watching TVAM. Now, how many of you can count Thomas, Gordon, Henry and Edward amongst your childhood friends? Well, I refer, of course, to the famous railway series of children's stories. Tonight, Thomas the Tank Engine and friends chuff their way onto our screens in the start of a new live-action animated series narrated by none other than Ringo Starr, who, of course, will be joining us very soon. But the original stories were written by the Reverend Wilbert Awdry, who we're delighted to have in the studio. Good morning to you, Reverend. I must say, the book's absolutely delightful. And they've all got these wonderful Clive Spong illustrations. And
you've got a first off.
This is the
copy.
This is the new book, isn't it?
I haven't had my complimentary copies yet.
Here you are now.
I must say, reading through the books, they always give you a tremendous sense of nostalgia for a sort of England that's past now. How long ago was it that you actually wrote them?
Well, they were first published in 1945, but I'd written them in 1943.
And children obviously still enjoy reading them now.
The first book, 3 Railway Engines.
Yes. And what prompted you to actually write them in the first place?
I've been answering that question for the last 40 years.
Do you want to do it again?
You should get it right this time, then.
When my son, aged 3, had measles,
yes.
he had to be kept amused.
Yes.
It was just as simple as that.
And isn't it right that all the engines are actually based on friends of your son, on boys that you knew?
Oh no. Edward and Henry were names that just came out of my head.
Yes. Well, I know that we've got a clip of the series which you've obviously been very closely involved with. Let's have a look at the clip, which is from one of the forthcoming episodes of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, and it's coming up any second now. And, of course, narrated by Ringo Starr.
Next morning, Thomas's driver and fireman came early and worked hard to mend the snowplow, but they couldn't make it fit. Thomas was pleased. "I shan't have to wear it, I shan't have to wear it," he puffed to Annie and Clarabel. But they were rather worried. "I hope it's all right, I hope it's all right," they whispered to each other. The driver was worried too. "It's not bad here," he said to the fireman, "but it's sure to be deep in the valley." "Silly soft stuff," puffed Thomas. "I didn't need that stupid old thing yesterday, and I shan't today. Snow can't stop me." He rushed into a tunnel thinking how clever he was, but there was trouble ahead. "Cinders and ashes," said Thomas. "I'm stuck." And he was.
Oh, that's absolutely fantastic. How did you get Ringo involved in it?
Well, that was Britt Allcroft, not me.
That's the producer?
Yes.
Is it right that he actually heard his voice on the television or something and didn't realise who it was?
I wouldn't know.
Yes. What do you think of him as Thomas? Is he how you imagined him to be?
Well, he's not Thomas. He's reading the stories.
Yes.
And I like him very much.
Great. What about, have you any ambitions to write any more? Because I know you
No, I finished.
Yes.
My son has taken over.
Oh, really?
Yes.
But he's actually writing stories.
Yes. He's done 2. Really Useful Engines, which was number 27, and James and the Diesel Engines, number 28. And he's got number 29 in preparation.
I bet you never thought it would take off like this when you first wrote these stories in 1943.
No idea at all. I just told them to amuse a sick child.
Mm-hmm. And did you write them down, before you told them, or did you just make them up as you went along and then suddenly think, well, I want to write these down?
Well, they evolved by question and answer. The first story, Edward's Day Outs. See, we'd exhausted all the entertainment value of nursery rhymes, except 2. One was early in the morning down at the station, all little engines standing in a row. And you know how it goes. There'd be a delighted chorus at the end.
Yes.
Puff, puff, chuff, chuff, off we go. So I just, for fun, I drew some engines standing in a row. Now there was a blank with their smoke box. And it was natural to fill the blank in with faces.
Yeah.
I'll have to stop you there, but I find absolutely riveting. We're on the right track, but we must move on in a moment. Can we chat again later on?
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed, because we're moving on to something that children also love, because it's Popeye time.
It was the wonderful sound that steam, right? For some reason we don't get the same sound out of diesel or electric, do we?
No.
The old steam.
No, a steam engine is an extrovert. He likes to know, likes you to know, how he's doing or how badly he's been treated.
Yeah.
He's always got something to say.
Can you detect from what he says how badly he's been treated or how well he's feeling?
Oh, yes.
Well, give me a badly treated sound then.
When I was small, I lived at Box.
Yeah.
And there's a gradient there between Box and Caution. And at night, lying in bed, I'd hear a goods train draw up at Box Station and crow for the banker. Beep, beep, beep. Then the banker would come out of the shed, buffer up behind, and crow, beep, beep, beep. And then you'd hear the train starting. The goods, the train engine would their puff-ins so as to say, I can't do it, I can't do it, I can't do it. And the banker would come up behind, oh yes you can, oh yes you can, oh yes you can.
You can put any words you like to train sounds, can't you?
Yes.
All that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Now what about Thomas the Tank Engine? You see, it's proved to be enormously popular all over the world with children who are a generation away from steam. They've never been on a steam train, they've never even seen a steam train except maybe in the films. What's the reason for the popularity? Have you ever thought why?
I just don't know, except that my children find themselves able to identify with the different characters of my engines. There's Percy, always ready for a joke, poor bare practical joke on someone.
And Gordon?
Yes, Gordon is rather the bossy sort of type.
Pompous, yes. And then there's Thomas, who's the greatest favourite.
Because I call Gordon after a small boy whose name actually was Gordon, who used to play with my small son. He was a bossy type. Yeah. And so Gordon, as a name for a bossy engine, was a natural.
Be careful now, he might well sue you for that, you know. If he's still about.
I haven't let out who he was.
No, not a sound of the surname. But I mean, it has been marvellous, Thomas the Tank Engine. The Thomas the Tank Engine books, Thomas the Tank Engine, everything's bags, books.
You can't miss Thomas
pens.
Nowadays.
No, can you?
No.
How did it become so international? What happened?
I just don't know.
Did you write it for yourself, or did you write it for you? Who'd you write it for?
Well, when you're writing a children's book, you're writing for a whole lot of people. Yeah. You're writing for yourself to make sure that you've got it researched right. You're writing for the unfortunate parents who've got to read it aloud, time after time after time after time. You've got to put in little funny bits, subtle bits, which they'll enjoy. And then there's the simple slapstick stuff, which the child will enjoy.
Thomas the Tank Engine, you've either never been or never known a child. Thomas is quite simply the most famous locomotive there is. He and his toot-tooting railway friends were the creation of an English country parson back in the 40s. Half a century later, they're still a runaway success, with 10 million books sold and a television show seen around the world. Come with us now on a journey into the time-warped world of Thomas, his friends, and those he's made rich and famous. Welcome to the mythical island of Soda, the green and hilly home of a little blue steam engine called Thomas. He and his friends have become heroes to millions of children around the world. Let's be honest about it, quite a few adults love him and his sunny world as well. I love the skies. Do many people say that to you?
All the time. Yes, they do. Designed specifically by my art director, who is also a pilot. So he's got a lot of knowledge of skies.
It's obviously drawn by a man who knows his clouds.
He does. He's up there all the time, yeah. But we have a passion for the island of Sodo, that the fluffy clouds are very important, friendly clouds, which match the character of Thomas.
Film director David Mitton loves his work. Who wouldn't? But the truth is that it demands an almost fanatical attention to detail to make the Thomas the Tank Engine television series the full steam ahead success that it's become.
It is exhausting, creatively, as well as the action of the trains and getting them right, the engines in particular, because you've got a complicity of electronics in there, the eyes working. If we get one detail wrong in foreground, we get a lot of letters.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I'm telling you.
The inspector stood on Edward's front, holding a noose of rope in the crook of the shunter's pole. He was trying to slip it over James's buffer. The engine swayed and lurched. At last! Got him! He shouted. He pulled the noose tight. Gently braking, Edward's driver checked the engine's speed.
In the making of the films, all the engines are treated very much like actors, and they behave like actors, and they really steam up and they go to work.
Don't you hate Britt Allcroft? She used to do what I'm doing now. Indeed, she was making a documentary about steam trains when she got the idea of buying the television rights to the Thomas the Tank Engine children's books. And now she's a millionaire.
I looked in many different directions for the cash. In the end, came back to my own doorstep and our local bank manager. But that involved mortgaging the house.
And for the price of that mortgage, in television terms at least, you own Thomas the Tank Engine.
Yes, yes.
A good investment. Fluffy clouds, sunny skies, a lovable toyland. And even if behind the scenes it really is a multi-million-dollar business, there's still plenty of room for eccentricity.
It's eaten into my soul all the time. Even dream about it now.
Dream about it?
Yeah. And the funny thing is that the dreams are generally sometimes could be better than the movie. Because I'm the engine driver, if you get my drift.
As he rumbled over the bridge,
It's true. You can't spend any time around Thomas the Tank Engine without getting seriously sucked in. It's an infectious story. And like all great children's stories, it started out as a tale told to a small child. Wait a minute. I think I see the kid over there now. His name is Christopher Audrey. His father was a country parson who made up the Thomas stories for him half a century ago. The years may have passed, but whoever grows up when it comes to steam trains?
I think the fascination for, certainly from the children's point of view, is that they can actually see it working. They can see the steam, they can see the rods moving, they can see the wheels moving. You get in a modern locomotive, a diesel locomotive, you press a button and it goes brum, and hopefully it moves. This you can actually see in action. You can see the power and feel it. And there's a sort of distinctive smell about a steam engine too.
Like Wind in the Willows or Alice in Wonderland, the Thomas stories, first told to a child, were later published and were hugely successful. Of course, Christopher grew up wanting to be a writer, but not just like his dad. He decided to write detective fiction, but it was clear he really didn't have a clue. The detective novels were never published.
You see, I wanted to write, but I was also determined at that time that I didn't want to write about Thomas the Tank Engine.
Because you didn't want to be in your father's shadow.
Exactly.
When his famous father, the Reverend W. Awdry, grew too old to write, the still unpublished Christopher decided to give Thomas a go. He wrote a new series of Thomas stories, and they were, of course, a runaway success. At last, Christopher was on the gravy train.
I would have liked to have made my own way by not using his characters. But the opportunity was there, and, you know, I'd have been a fool to turn it down, wouldn't I?
Absolutely. It's made you a very wealthy man, but it hasn't really changed your life.
Well, I hope it hasn't. I don't feel very wealthy.
His father is rich too, but it's even harder to tell. This is a home of the Reverend W. Pretty modest for a man whose writings have earned reputedly more than £10 million. Only the name of the house, Sodor, Thomas's Island, gives any clue about its famous occupant. What no one told me was that these days the Reverend W is a very grumpy, bedridden old man. And he's got a terrible cough, but at least he's still able to smoke.
So, can you tell me where and how it all started?
Oh, this is the story I've been telling for the last 30 or 40 years. I'm sick of it.
Oh dear, this really isn't going very well at all.
But you're all behind the times. My books have been bestsellers in Australia, New Zealand, for the past 30 years.
Maybe we should have done the story 30 years ago.
Yes, you should. Not waited until I'm in my dotage.
The newspapers say you've become a multi-millionaire. Have you become a rich man?
Well, they're talking rubbish.
So you didn't make £10 million from royalties from the television?
I've got no idea how much.
And what about that television series that earned him all those royalties that he doesn't seem to know he's got? What does the creator of Thomas the Tank Engine think of his invention on television?
Like the curate egg, good in parts.
And what parts aren't good?
First two series were all right. They more or less stuck to my stories. But then the success of them made the producers get what I call big-headed. They showed their lamentable ignorance.
But they've fallen into error.
Yes.
Thomas thinks no engine works as hard as he does. He loves playing tricks on them, including Gordon, the biggest and proudest engine of all.
Some of the credit for the Thomas success must go to the voiceover man, former Beatle, Ringo Starr, who gives us the drum.
People were waiting at the station just before the bridge. They wanted to see what would happen.
The rest of the family were in the sitting room one night watching television. I was going past the door and I heard this voice.
Henry was feeling stuffed up.
And I thought, that's the voice for Thomas the Storyteller. And I walked into the room and Ringo Starr was being interviewed on a chat show. So I wrote to him and we met. And I said, I think you've got the perfect voice to be Thomas the Storyteller.
Soon they could see the boys, and they all had stones.
If you follow the plot, then you know all about plucky little Thomas who shunts the carriages for the big engines like Henry, James and Gordon. Then there's the nasty Diesels, really the only villains on the happy island of Sodor.
He roared, gave a great heave.
And of course, overseeing the whole railway and its operation, the Fat Controller.
Silence! Snapped the Fat Controller. Percy and Duck, I am pleased with your work today, but not with your behavior tonight. This is my railway, and I give the orders.
Here for one glorious day on a little branch line in the south of England, Thomas fans and railway buffs have joined forces to recreate, full scale, the world of Thomas the Tank Engine. And one of the lucky enthusiasts, a local businessman, actually gets to realise his lifelong ambition to play the Fat Controller.
So how much is this fair dinkum, Thomas?
Very much so. It is very, very much so. If you get a picture of Thomas and look at this, it is a carbon copy.
And what's all this muck that I've got all over me?
Well, unfortunately, that's some...
Where's all this stuff? And will it come off?
That's Australian rain.
What is it?
Yeah, it's only much from the boiler. Bit of water.
Your trains are very messy, Fat Controller.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'll give my slip. Here yourself.
The Fat Controller originally was introduced in the 3 railway engines as a dig at pompous officials whom I abominate.
I've never met on any story as many eccentrics as I've met on this one.
Well, all railway people are eccentric. You've got to be involved like we do. Who would come down to this place on a Saturday afternoon for no money on a gorgeous day and work on steam engines?
And get covered in
oil and everything else, play on the track, paint coaches, and just generally enjoy themselves. Cup final day in May. Where are they? They're all down here playing trains. It's in the blood.
Now, if you haven't noticed the shortage of girl trains on this line, others have. Lately, there have been shock accusations that Thomas is blatantly sexist. Well, it happened to Noddy, and it happened to Bill and Ben, the flower pot men. So is Thomas the Tank Engine now to be derailed by political correctness?
Hurry up, you.
What does Thomas think about this?
Thomas's opinion hasn't actually been asked, you see, but I have plans for that.
So there's trouble down the tracks for Thomas?
Who knows? I don't think so, really.
Meanwhile, back at the station, it's the adults who seem to be having all the fun. It makes you wonder whether this whole Thomas the Tank Engine business really is just for kids. Look at the way you're dressed. When are you going to grow up? You're a middle-aged man.
Middle-aged man? Good heavens, son, not a middle-aged man at all. Never. Never. I've been like this since I'm a kid. I've loved the train since I'm a little boy, and I still do.
What do you want children to get out of Thomas the Tank Engine?
Entertainment.
No more than that.
That's what they were written for.
Six degrees in Toronto. Now you're up to date. I'm Dan Turner, Chum News. Andy K.
In for Russ McLeod. Good afternoon. It's 2:02 in Toronto.
Sounds like a dirty job, and one that can end up badly for everyone. Doesn't it sort of remind you of James and Percy? It was a splendid morning on the island of Sodor. James was feeling very pleased with himself. His red paint gleamed in the sunshine as he sped along the line. He reached the junction just as Percy puffed in with some freight cars. James was surprised to see him. What are you doing here, Percy? You should be at the station by now.
He's Canadian. Yeah.
How do you know he's Canadian?
He talks like a Canadian, like me and all the other people. And there's another engine who is called Donald, and he's from the West, the Wild West. He has the same name as me, D-O-N-A-L-D, Donald, and he's a twin, like me.
I think people were looking for something that was totally nonviolent, totally interesting, a little bit educational because it teaches them about train travel and everything. I think he just came along at exactly the right time. Maybe he was discovered 40 years later, but I think that's why he's so magical.
Good morning. My talk is entitled Growing Up with Thomas the Tank Engine. My father's love of trains came from my grandfather, who was also a vicar. While Dad was still a toddler, my grandfather used to take him for walks, and they invariably ended up near the railway track, where they would stand and watch steam trains together.
Well, I suppose our childhood memory, and lying in bed at night, one would hear a heavy goods from South Wales or elsewhere come into the station, stop and crow for a banker. The banker would come out of its shed, buffer up behind, and crow to be ready, and then the two engines would start off up the hill. And the boy's imagination, you could hear the two engines talking to each other. I can't do it, I can't do it, I can't do it, I can't do it. And the banker behind, oh yes you can, oh yes you can, oh yes you can. Yes, you can. And you'd hear them working their way up the hill. The goods engine complaining and the banker saying in effect, you're making a fuss about nothing. You can do it. You can do it. You can do it. You can do it. And I suppose that childhood memory was the basis of these subsequent stories.
Winter came, and with it dark, heavy clouds full of snow. "I don't like it," said Thomas's driver. "A heavy fall is coming. I hope it doesn't stop us." "Pooh," said Thomas, seeing the snow melt on the rails. "Soft stuff, nothing to it."
Wilbert became a clergyman. He became a clergyman eventually, I suspect, because his father had become a clergyman. He had his second curacy. He was down in Wiltshire. He was quite a young clergyman. And he believed, with the outbreak of the Second World War, that he had to follow a pacifist line. He had to be a pacifist. Now, this wasn't a particularly popular thing to believe at the time. And Wilbert stood by this belief absolutely, determinedly, even though his own vicar said that he had to leave and go and find another parish.
When my brother Christopher was 3 years old, he had measles, and he had to be kept in a darkened room. So it fell to my father, who was a curate, working from home as it were, to entertain him. Well, they went through all the nursery rhymes. but they eventually lost their entertainment value from continual repetition, except for 2 rhymes. One of these was, early in the morning, down at the station, see the little engines all in a row. Along comes the driver, pulls a little lever, puff puff, peep peep, off we go. Dad drew very simple engine faces. He wasn't a very good artist, and he would do happy face, sad face, cross face. But it was the sad face that appealed to Christopher, probably because he was feeling ill. What's that engine's name, Daddy? Edward, the first name that came into his head. Why is that engine sad, Daddy? Because he's old and he hasn't been out for a long time. Why hasn't he been out for a long time? Because all the other engines are bigger and stronger than him, and the drivers choose them first. And if you read Edward's Day Out in the 3 railway engines, you will see that that is precisely how it all began.
Once upon a time, there was a little engine called Edward. He lived in a shed with 5 other engines. They were all bigger than Edward and boasted about it. The driver won't choose you again, they said. He wants big, strong engines like us. Edward had not been out for a long time. He began to feel sad. Just then the driver and fireman came along to start work. The driver looked at Edward. "Why are you sad?" he asked. "Would you like to come out today?" "Yes, please," said Edward. So the fireman lit the fire and made a nice lot of steam. Then the driver pulled the lever and Edward puffed away. "Peep, peep," he whistled. "Look at me now."
The family were used as testers for the new stories being written. Dad would come to a meal complete with a script for a new story and would read it out to us to see what we thought. Sometimes we approved, and other times it wasn't right. And then we would get the story up to 6 times until we were happy with it.
This is a great occasion, really, isn't it? It's celebrating, something 50th. And it's 21 years since I saw your picture,
Yes,
and you came along after we got to London. You finished with the last book,
yes,
with me when I left.
I think I was a bit of a midwife, really. I think that explains it, because I looked after the editorial side, the production, the costing, the design, the advertising, for those 26 years, really. My idea was, which I used in advertising in subsequent year, was this idea of small books for small hands. The idea of 4 stories in one little book was a very good idea in my view as bedtime stories, because parents in fact don't like to go through 64 pages. They would much prefer to go through 16 pages and stop.
The difficulty with the books really was the fact that although their shape was extremely unconventional, the 4 1/4 by 5 5/8, they were extraordinarily easy to sell because of the single opening of each page with a picture on one side and story on the other. And selling these books to a bookseller in a busy shop, you could speak to them over the pictures. They didn't read the text, they looked at the pictures.
Soon afterwards, a porter came and spoke to his driver. "Gordon can't get up the hill. Will you take Edward and push him, please?" They found Gordon halfway up the hill and very cross. His driver and fireman were talking to him severely. "You're not trying," they told him.
Were you surprised when the books became a great success?
Well, I was astonished. And I still am astonished.
This is all the Thomas treasures. It's the artwork from 38 books, right from the very beginning when Thomas the Tank Engine was written in 1946. My favourites, I think, are the original Dorby artwork, the very early Thomas artwork, because I think it's the artwork that children appreciate. I think the colours are very bright, and they somehow are very friendly versions of the famous engines. Now, what would you like to see? I mean, do you want
see some original manuscript?
Right. Well, when the manuscripts first came in from the Reverend Audrey, he wrote them by hand on the back of church circulars, and he did these funny little naive pictures, which showed that right from the very start he intended his engines to have faces. Originally, they were only written down because the Reverend Audrey's son used to remember the stories as his father told them to him, and he would correct his father if he varied from the original storyline. So his father wrote them down so that he couldn't be caught out.
Perhaps you better put that back and lock the safe up.
Yes, right. All safe and sound.
I gradually worked out under what disciplines the books were actually written. One book must follow on from another, and that the engines and scenery shown in one book should correspond with the scenery in previous books. And that created a problem which had to be solved. And that was only solved when we discovered the island of Sodor and standardized the scenery.
Wilbert Audrey had this obsession to understand the island of Sodor, a place where all these engines could run, and they could run authentically, so that there was no sense in which these were fictional engines. They were engines which followed their own true railway logic. Sodor is a great crossword puzzle. It's bringing together all these disparate, unrelated ideas and making them part of a whole new mythology. And there aren't many people who have done that. J.R.R. Tolkien, in creating Middle-earth, created his own land, his own language, his own geography, his own sense of place in which to put his stories. Wilbert Audrey is one of the few other people who has done that.
The engine's name was Henry. His driver and fireman argued with him, but he would not move. "The rain will spoil my lovely green paint and red stripes," he said. The guard blew his whistle till he had no more breath and waved his flags till his arms ached, but Henry still stayed in the tunnel and blew steam at him. "I'm not going to spoil my lovely green paint and red stripes for you," he said rudely.
There were other principles as well. First of all, they had to be accurate. In other words, the story, however offbeat, on which the stories in my book were based, had to have actually happened to some engine, somewhere, sometime. You remember the story of in Duck and the Diesel, how Duck crashed through a barber's shop. And the barber was quite calm about it. It's only an engine. Well, I got that from a page of offbeat accidents in the Railway Gazette. That actually happened at one of the Hull stations.
One of the engines in Edward's shed was called Gordon. He was very big and very proud. "You watch me this afternoon, little Edward," he boasted, "as I rush through with the express. That'll be a splendid sight for you."
My father did have problems with artists who didn't know anything about trains. And they would draw the same engine differently on several different pages. And of course, small children are very quick to pick this up. And they write to the author and point out these mistakes.
Well, Audrey was fairly specific about which way he wanted the engines to face, and so you were stuck with having either the back end of an engine with no face on at all, or else some very peculiar view where you could just about see the face. But generally it was a fairly straightforward process, provided I remembered which way round engines faced on the railway line.
I suppose what struck me most about them was the incredible vivid colour. I mean, it seems like a rather banal thing to say, but if you think about the 50s, most books were fairly grey, and those books that weren't were printed on a kind of rather sort of browny paper, and maybe were just 2 or 3 colours, and there was something about these tank engine books that they were incredibly vivid, incredibly bright, and almost kind of glowing. Now, I mean, there's several moments in the Thomas the Tank Engine books that I can remember and I've carried with me for all my life, and I suppose one of the key ones is the moment when Henry gets bricked up in the very first of the Thomas Tank Engine books, the 3 railway engines. Now, this has just been handed to me, and I've just seen this for the first time for something like what must be 45 years. And I went, this is incredible, because I've held the picture in my head, I've held the picture there, and then suddenly I'm seeing it, and it's an extraordinary thing in which the two things are meeting.
It's more real than we could possibly imagine, and it seems to remind us of a world that is gone. As you look at those drawings, first drawn by C. Reginald Dalby, you see those green hills and the blue distant mountains and the sea beyond, and you see the cows strolling through the meadows, and you see the children standing alongside the line waving at the trains as they go by. That is an evocation of an age that is gone, and it's always created in glowing iridescent colours, and those colours and those pictures leap off the page at you.
Some of the stones hit Henry's boiler and spoilt his paint. One hit the fireman on the head as he was shoveling coal, and others broke the carriage windows. It's a shame, hissed Henry. They've broken our glass, sobbed the coaches.
I'm scraping off glue that's imposing on the image of the painting, so I can clean it off and it's good for reproduction. This type of series has got lots of glue damage. Some has had some kind of skinning of the surface. The paper's come off and I've had to replace the paper and paint over it. Or lots of the paint has popped off from the surface of the picture and I've had to repaint the image.
The driver and fireman were drinking cocoa in the brake van. The guard pulled out his watch. "The kipper's due," he said. "Who cares?" said the fireman. "This is good cocoa."
"Cocoa, my dear engine," he gasped. "Save me!" Boko quickly sized up the situation and sent Bill and Ben about their business. They were cheeky at first, but Boko threatened to take away the trucks of coal he'd bought for them. That made them behave at once. Gordon thought he was wonderful. "Those little demons," he said. "How do you do it?" "Ah, well," said Boko, "it's just a knack." Gordon thinks to this day that Boko saved his life, but we know that the twins were only teasing, don't we?
Reading the stories nowadays, one does get the impression that, to begin with, say for the first 5 books, the stories are told on a much
no, not a much younger level, but on at a more young level than they later became. Father developed as a writer, of course, and I think the stories developed with him. He began to use more complicated plots.
And then you've got to remember that you're not merely writing for children, you're writing for the unfortunate people, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, grandfathers, grandmothers, who've got to read the children, the stories aloud. Not just once, but over and over and over again. And so the story must be easy to read.
Henry comes home and it's his birthday. And I said happy birthday. There's this big hole where all the presents have to go in there. And there's trees and you know these bits on the top of the engines? Well, you know, what is it? I forgot now. Henry is chosen to take some fish to some place, and then he goes really fast and he slips off the line, and then he had new coal when he was going, and he got his old coal back, but he got a new shaping body.
But again and again the books are returning to the idea of order and who's in charge. And obviously we know the Fat Controller, that he's the big chief. And then we have the engines, and there's a hierarchy between the engines as to who's entitled to pull the express trains, and little Thomas the Tank, who thinks that he's a bit better than that. And then below that, below the level of the engines, you've got the carriages.
The passengers came and argued too, but Henry would not move. The fat director, who was on the train, told the guard to get a rope. "We'll pull you out," he said.
Drive up! Why are you late?
We've got no train left on our trailer.
I'm afraid that's not good enough. You're very late. You've thrown everything out of Cancan.
Oh, very sorry.
I'll have to ask you to come and see me afterwards, okay? Who is the driver anyway?
Mr Malcolm.
Malcolm? Gary Malcolm? Oh, well that explains a lot. Right. Tell him I'd like to see him afterwards.
Good.
I was rather annoyed with bureaucrats in high places who issued directives but didn't do anything themselves to help implement them. And that's what the first fat director was inclined to do. 1, 2, 3, push, he said, but didn't push himself. My doctor has forbidden me to push, he said.
There is certainly an analogy to be drawn between the fact that the engines are governed by a sort of omnipresent being, and if you care to equate the Fat Controller with God in that sense, then fine. I don't think really that was the original concept, but Father being a clergyman, maybe it was a subconscious one.
Audrey's fed into them, really, the way in which children relate to adults. That's actually what you're talking about. You're talking about children in families and children in schools, and the hierarchical world that children belong to, and younger children and older children. And Audrey very cleverly has, in a sense, taken those ideas about hierarchy and order and put them on to objects that we used to see around us the whole time.
I don't set out to write a moral story. When I was young, we used to, on Sundays, we used to have to read horribly boring moral stories about good little boys and girls who, in our opinion, my brothers and I opinion, wanted kicking rather than... They were so beastly good. And they were held up as moral examples. Well, my stories are nothing like that. The engines are have human characteristics. Like children, faced with a prohibition, as every child does, they push it and push it and push it to see how far they can go without bringing trouble on themselves. And then they do find it, but in my engines, they may be punished, but they're not scrapped. They have to express sorrow and intention of amendment, and then they're brought back into the family, so to speak.
Well, Thomas, so you and your driver have been fishing, but fish doesn't suit you, and we must get them out. So the driver and the fireman fetched rods and nets, and they all took turns at fishing in Thomas's tank, while the fat controller told them how to do it.
Thank you.
There we are. Your colour, are you?
Yes. That's all right. That's lovely, isn't it? Thank you very much.
I hope you'll enjoy that story.
In the early 80s, someone called Britt Allcroft came along. She is a businesswoman and her children had loved the railway stories. The books had been going strong for over 35 years and were obviously here to stay. So she had talks with my father about making a TV series of the stories.
What first attracted me to the stories were and still are the characters, the adventures, the situations they get into. And this is what made me want to bring them to life on the screen, with all the things that a multi-dimensional world can do, with music and sound effects. And I think that the fact that the characters are largely steam trains, although not all of them, has an appeal, because I think the sound of a train whistle has a universal appeal.
What we're waiting for is a whole parade of engines coming past the station, which you see. You've got Thomas, Toby and Percy, who are quite astounded by this great parade of engines coming past. This is the story where it's Fat Controller's engines, where actually all the major engines are all going off to London to a big show for all the kids. Pleasantly animated, looking at your sins here.
Yes.
I think that one probably shows the station structure.
I think yes, if you had that. We've got three angles on there, haven't you?
The filmic translations of these things are very difficult in many ways, because there's a terrific difference from a chap sitting on an end of a bed telling a little chap in bed, which you probably know yourself, where you can stop between sentences and really get into detail because he's asking you the questions. In filming it, you've got to explain all the questions filmically.
there so that there's no mistake, there's no misunderstanding, and the story is clear.
One video is when Thomas wants to go fishing, and in the end he gets some water from the river and he gets fish in his boiler, and then they have to fish it out, and then they have a supper of fish and chips.
It was old and had 5 holes, so they had to fill it, pull it up and empty it into Thomas's tank as quickly as they could, several times over.
The TV series only started off because previously the engine series were bestsellers. Over the years, the engine series had got up to 8 million. It was only then that Bridolkoff and Co. thought it might be a good thing to cash in on.
Do you feel that those television programs are still your work?
No. Some of them, some of them are based rather loosely on my stories, but they're so obsessed with the popularity of Thomas that they have what I can only call crane-shunted Thomas to all sorts of unlikely places in order to get him into or force him into a particular story, whether the story was written with Thomas in mind or not.
I'm just doing some black and white initial ideas for Thomas's 50th birthday for the point of sale that we're going to be producing. The first one I came up with was having Thomas on a sort of like a landscape, just a flat piece of card that will have Thomas moving across and out to the trees and the bushes, which is quite a simple way that probably work using different mechanisms. But I think the one that's going to be most exciting is having Thomas coming out the shed and the doors opening at the same time.
I think we've probably published more than 50 million Thomas books all in all, if you count in the American and Japanese editions along with the English ones. Although Thomas had been very successful in the first 40 years, in the last decade sales have skyrocketed. And in very general terms, our own publishing revenues, which used to be in the environs of about $250,000 a year, are now probably $5 million a year.
Now on to customer promotions. Claire, we've got a good, we've had some good presentations with Smiths, Dillons, etc. How much commitment do you think we've got so far?
Well, I mean, they all say they're interested. I think, I mean, it's really now that we've got to get back to them and start firming things up. I think on the Smiths side, they said that they'd run a gondola promotion, didn't they?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, we've got a budget of 100,000 above and below the line, so let's make the most of it. It's not often we get that sort of money to play with on our marketing budget.
I just picked up, just starting from the book principle, Thomas Noisy Book, and I've had wonderful fun with this because we can hear the train and the coaches and the whistles and even a helicopter. And I don't know how he got in there, but that's the cops, and then my favourite.
Really useful engine. Really useful engine.
This, of course, is the fun part of the campaign. It's where we get Thomas Tank Engine onto the London city streets in the form of a London taxicab. And
absolutely.
Having rolling round the city centre in London. This is the final design before it actually goes to the taxi company.
I think it works really well. I think the decals come up well.
Well, we even put some on the roof as well, so that people on buses can see it. I've got a feeling.
Brilliant idea.
I've got a feeling that a lot of city centre gents are going to get some pangs of
boyhood.
Exactly.
But of course, you've got a whole apparatus now that supports Thomas the Tank Engine. You've got the videos, you've got the TV programs, you've got the posters, you've got the models. And that, in fact, of course, is like a great whole world that you can now inhabit.
If the audience embrace the characters and the stories, whom they first discover on the screen, maybe they first discover them in the books, but maybe they first discover them on the screen, that they will then want these characters and stories as part of their life, whether it be as toys or as a notepad or a pair of shoes or whatever.
It's the perfect product because it's not seasonal, it sells all the year round, but interesting enough also it allows you to produce a very good quality product. In turnover terms we do around £4.5 million a year on Thomas. He was very, very successful. In the States, for example, we'll probably sell around 12 million Thomas characters. But Thomas has gone to Australia, and Thomas is also very big in Japan now.
I think that stories have transcended national borders because basically they are universal, and small children are alike really all around the world. The gist is the strong storyline, the fun characters, and I think that in certain cultures where railways are a feature, such as in Japan and Norway, interesting enough, the series really has taken hold. I mean, it's interesting in Japan, the books were very popular long before the television series, and I do think that's because in Japan trains are a very important part of daily life.
Thomas の市場規模をお話ししていただけますでしょうか。
日本におけるトーマスの市場規模で、過去何年かあるんですが、その中で一番大きかった年が約市場規模で170億円ほどの規模になりました。
機関車トーマス。トーマスとゴードンというお話。トーマスは小さなタンク機関車。イギリスのソドー島の大きな駅で働いている。
子供たちはね、あれがイギリスのものだって分かっている子たちっていうのはいないと思うんですね。一緒に、ポンキッキという番組で放送されてるんですが、ポンキッキーズ、ごめんなさい、最近ポンキッキーズという番組になってタイトルが変わったんですけど、ポンキッキーズを見てるお母さん方もトーマスが
We have brought these stories on the screen to countries as diverse as Japan and the United States is in such a way as they can be embraced by people in those countries, and they're not kind of imposed on them. All our experience is that, for instance, in Japan, Japanese audiences embrace these characters and stories as their own. They become kind of indigenous to the country.
Britt has unfortunately written some of her own stories and sells them under the legend based on the Reverend Audrey's Railway series. Her stories are based on fantasy rather than fact.
The first two sets of videos were, in my mind, quite good because they stuck in the main to my stories. There's a success, I think, made the producers somewhat big-headed, and in the third series they thought that they could write my stories for them. In so doing, they only revealed their lamentable ignorance of railway practice. For instance, the video called Henry's Forest.
Henry the Green Engine has lived on the island of Sodor for many years. He wouldn't want to be anywhere else.
The story was about Henry, an engine. Henry is, in that story, is enraptured by the forest which he goes through. Now, what interest does a steam locomotive have in scenery? On one occasion in the story, the driver says to Henry, "We've made good time over the last section, let's stop for a bit." Well, what responsible driver would stop as if he was in a roadside lay-by? You can't do it. They've shown a lamentable ignorance of Rule 55.
You're no stranger to Rule 55 then?
Well, I am strange to all the rules, actually, because I have to refer to it, but you can tell me what Rule 55 is.
Rule 55 is a protection of trains when they come to a stand, reminding of the signalman of the position of your train, sending your fireman within a minute, 2 minutes to the signal box to sign the book and ensure that the signalman is aware of your position on the track. That's Rule 55.
Autumn was changing the leaves from green to brown. The fields were changing too, from yellow stubble to brown earth. As Thomas puffed along, he heard the chug, chug, chug of a tractor at work.
My father, a widower, now 83, still lives in his own home with a resident housekeeper carer. Dad has been called the Puff Puff Parson. He has even been called eccentric. The creator of these stories sometimes wonders whether he dreamt up Thomas or Thomas dreamt up him. But the Reverend Audrey is destined to be remembered as the Thomas the Tank Engine Man.
The children and their parents are still buying these books in thousands about an age that is gone. I'm on a par with Willy Bunter or William. Nobody goes to school at a place like Billy Bunter, and nobody lives nowadays in a sort of suburban house like Richmond Crompton's William. But there it is.
There's Thomas the Tank goes fishing, or there's Thomas the Tank and Henry the Green Engine. Now tell me, Katie, if it's you'd like one like...
I can see no end to it. I think it's great fun to sit back and watch other people being sceptical about it, when I have that gut feeling that Thomas will go on forever because I've worked with him for so long, and I have seen no evidence of children going off him.
How would you like to be remembered?
I'd like to be remembered as an author who perhaps understood children, perhaps how they, in a small sense, understood perhaps how their minds work. I don't know.
My oldest child, who is now 24 years old, my daughter Ireland, you have a child, and of course that launches you into the world of contemporary, or at least at that time contemporary, children's media and programming. I grew up in a different reality. I grew up in Bugs Bunny and, Popeye and these silly, and all the Warner Brothers cartoons. But at that time, Thomas was everywhere. And you would hear that song, dun, da, 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 da. And I love the naivete of it. I love the innocence of it. I thought it was really I love the simplicity of it. I think it was Britt reached out to me, and Carlin had done some of it. I think Ringo was before me, and she asked me if I would voice a season of the show. And the key is that I met Britt. And when I met Britt, who's this incredibly unusual woman, and she told me the story about how she got the books, the Railway series, and I just adored Britt. And when she said to me, do you want to do this show? I said, sure. Very often when you do projects in this business, it's who's doing the asking. And there is, kind of an unavoidable likability factor. And I just really loved Britt. She was just a great lady, and we did a couple seasons of that. And then they asked me to do the film, which is a whole other saga.
Important day, Mr. C? It is a very important day.
I think for me, and I tell people this all the time, if ever I'm talking to students, if you're interacting with student actors or what have you, that among the most difficult things to do in acting, I think, is to be light and joyful and to be happy. We all have anger inside of us. We all have pain inside of us and difficult things we've gone through. And in acting, it's easier to cry than it is to laugh. It's easier to give some very admonishing speech in a courtroom or what have you than it is to be a protagonist in a children's fantasy film and to keep it warm and simple and to have a positive lilt in everything you say. What I said to myself was, you can go too far, and I'm sure some would argue I went too far, but I do come from that mindset where you're sitting there going, what time is it, Bob? You keep everything you say, what time is it?
You seem puzzled, Mr. Conductor.
Well, I am puzzled. This place looks like the island of Sodor, but
How would Burnett Stone travel there without gold dust? Sparkle's been the only way to make the trip since the lost engine disappeared.
You know, to keep everything light, bright, warm, and simple. That's tough to do. And some days you come to work and you're just not in the mood to be like, you know, we better head back to the station. And that kind of thing. But that was the job, I felt, was to keep that character someone who was like a host. You're the host. The other characters are going through everything, and you're there kind of as a guide to help the kids go through the whole story.
Anyway, I just came to say goodbye. I have to go now.
Right now?
Why, yes, Stacy, I have to make sure that everything is safe and sound on the island of Sodor, just as I try to do here.
When we did the TV show, it was one situation, which was, it was Britt's baby, and she called all the shots, and we'd go into a booth, and she would give you very simple directions, and you know, slow this down, pace this up, come in quicker here. When we did the movie, which was not the TV show, it was live action, we were there performing, which was a big difference, and behaving, and wearing wardrobe, and staging scenes, and so forth.
It's a beautiful day. I mean, we're down, but we're not out.
No, we're out.
But we are not down.
I'm always of the belief that there's a right amount of takes. There's a right amount. It could be 4, it could be 8, it could be 11. And again, with this kind of children's programming, there's an ear you have. You develop an ear. Everything is sound in children's programming.
No. Now my gold dust really is all gone. And if I can't find the source for making more, I know how bad the consequences will be. I saw them in my dream last night. My family never really told me what to do in a gold dust crisis. They only said if you can't remember the clue, the windmill will remind you. But where is the windmill? Cool? Okay, can we do one more right away?
I remember with the Mr. Conductor thing, I wanted to kind of keep it positive and warm and sweet even, but not the same throughout. So there were sometimes I think I lost my train of thought, and I thought I was on a Scorsese film. So I thought, let's do 30 takes of me saying, it's 4 o'clock. You want to give the director what they want. Most of the directors I've worked with, most, not all, but most are people who I admired a lot and wanted to make their movie. When you start out doing a movie, the director's the one that makes the movie, not you. You're an element of it. And filmmaking is an extraordinarily collaborative process, and you want to make sure that you're doing your part. And there were a few directors that I wanted to please as much as Britt, because I just liked her so much personally.
What is that? That's right, it's sugar, Diesel. And if I throw this in your tank, it'll seize you up for good. Make the most of tonight, Twinkle Toes, because you won't like tomorrow.
Mara had some difficulties before we started rolling the camera, and she came to work, and we were all very concerned about that. I think her mother had passed away, and she was very, very despondent about that. Remember, that was something that cast a shadow over a lot of what we did, was her emotional state as a result of this obviously terrible thing.
I have to tell you something, Mr. C. I've heard a train whistle, and it sounded like it was coming from the mountain.
Mountain. I just remembered another part of the clue. Stoke up the magic in the mountain and the lady will smile. But we need more information, Lily. And I know that your grandpa could help.
Britt had partners at a company that were doing this with her. And as with most movies you do, there's a swarm of non-creative people giving you their opinions of the film. And the thing I love about Britt was, like all good directors, she didn't transmit any of her tension on the set of the film. The Brit that I worked with in the booth of the TV show was the same Brit that showed up every day for the film. And I think that there's a part of me that what was difficult about the film in that way was that she thought she'd proven herself. And she didn't have to do that anymore and have to kind of convince men of what she could do or what she was capable of. There did seem to be a bit of that when we made the film of Britt Allcroft having to go back to a place that she thought she'd earned her position. She'd earned the right to have that creative self-determinism about the film. She would go off and have conversations with people, not a lot, I don't want to exaggerate, and then come back and not look very happy, and then shake that off and engage with us. She was always the warm, positive conductor, if you will. She was Mrs. Conductor, Ms. Conductor, of the filmmaking experience and keeping it positive under those two difficult things.
You know, Junior, there is a railroad. With palm trees? One or two. And sunshine? Sunny spells. I'll take it. What's the way? This is the way.
When I did it, I felt, you know, when we did the TV programming at the time of the film, it was right at the height of that. It was really, really like everywhere. I had people walk up to me and they would stop and they'd snap their fingers and they would turn to their little kid and they'd say, "Do you know who this is?" They'd say, "This is Mr. Conductor." Some of them got it. The parents were almost always more excited than I was about it. They sent me a chest that was a promotional gift they sent to my daughter. I probably should have just taken this and put it in storage somewhere. They gave me a chest that was designed like Thomas. So one end of the chest had the face of the character and the back was the rear. And then you opened up the middle was a chest and it was filled with Thomas toys. And it was stunning. I loved it. And it was at the foot of my daughter's bed for a while. I don't know what happened to it, but I wish I had it back. I'd put it in my office right now if I could.
Well, see you in shining time.
This is certainly one of my favourite stories, and I believe it was one of Father's favourites too. It's called Thomas Comes to Breakfast. Thomas the Tank Engine has worked his branch line for many years. "You know just where to stop, Thomas," laughed his driver. "You could almost manage without me." Thomas had become conceited. He didn't realise his driver was joking. "Driver says I don't need him now," he told the others. "Don't be so daft," snorted Percy. "I'd never go without my driver," said Toby earnestly. "I'd be frightened." "Pooh," boasted Thomas, "I'm not scared." "You'll never dare." "I would then. You'll see."
Thomas and his railway friends have been riding the rails for 70 years. Children all over the world have grown up fascinated by the tales and adventures of this cheeky little tank engine and have cherished the strong messages of friendship, teamwork, and what it means to be a really useful engine.
Look, Edward, look! I'm blue, just like you!
You're also #1.
Does that mean I'm the best?
Raise your hand if you're the biggest Thomas fan.
You're a bigger Thomas fan than us?
He had 6 wheels, a large stumpy funnel, a dome, a cab, and then the classic eyes rolling around. I can never get enough of that.
Thomas' face is funny. That's silly.
Everybody wants to look at the engines, right? It's fun, it's exciting, it's fast moving.
When Jason watches Thomas and Friends, he is in their world. He talks to the trains and he creates stories.
I came from a generation of producers who believed that kids' television had the potential to make the world a better place. It's just an incredible feeling when you actually see it work.
I feel like I'm actually on a real life train.
There's something about trains that people still love. They've got a character all of their own.
My favorite character is Montague, Ducks. He's really funny when he talks.
I like Prissy. He's cute. I like Frankie. He lifts crates up. He can't move because he doesn't have any wheels.
Which one's your favorite train?
That's all of them.
Oh, too heavy.
Too heavy? I think you can get more.
I like Birdie. You'll get ya.
I've always loved Lights of Gordon, mainly because he ends up shooting his mouth off and then coming to mischief later on.
Toad and Oliver are awesomest. Mr. Oliver, can we leave now? Yes, Toad, we can.
Toby's my favourite, and Father always used to claim his engines were a family, and in a family you don't have favourites.
My favorite character is Thomas, because he goofs around.
Better luck next time, Birdie!
The original Railway series stories were written and published in 1945 by the Reverend W. Awdry.
My name's Christopher Awdry. I'm the son of the creator of Thomas the Tank Engine. My father created the first stories for me when I was ill in bed with measles at the age of 2.5. He then made me a small model engine, and I asked for stories about my engine. He said, okay, yeah, I can make up stories about your engine, but first it has to have a name. Why don't we call it Thomas the Tank Engine? In early 1943, the war was on and nothing much was happening in the way of children's books at all. My mother went out to buy books for me, couldn't find anything, and came home and said to Father, you ought to get those railway stories published. He hawked them around for a while, and finally found a publisher who said, okay, I'll take them on. And indeed it came out in 1945. It sold 20,000 in the first 6 months. And the rest, as they say, is history.
The very first television show, which was produced by Britt Allcroft, was a live action show, and that was 1984 that first came out, and that was based on Britt interviewing the Reverend Awdry and being so enthralled by his stories that she thought, I've got to make a TV show for kids about this railway.
Thomas is a tank engine who lives at a big station on the island of Sodor. He's a cheeky little engine with 6 small wheels, a short stumpy funnel, a short stumpy boiler, and a short stumpy dome.
He woke again in daylight. Percy and Toby were still asleep. Silly stick in the mud, he chuckled. I'll show him. Driver hasn't come yet, so here goes. Thomas thought he was being clever, but really he was only moving because a careless cleaner had meddled with his controls. He tried to wheesh, but he couldn't. He tried to stop, but he couldn't. Thomas's wheels left the rails and crunched the tarmac. Horrors! He exclaimed and shut his eyes. He didn't dare look at what was coming next.
Thomas the Tank Engine soon found his way into the hearts of thousands of British children, and it wasn't long before the stories of a little railway travelled far and wide.
My first introduction to Thomas, I was on an elevator at WNET, which is the local PBS station, and the head of the station had just come back from England, and he handed me a cassette, and he said, take a look at it and see if we can do anything with it. And when I put it in the VCR, it was an early cut of Thomas the Tank Engine. And so that was the first time, I think, probably anyone in the United States had ever actually seen Thomas. I showed it to my wife, then I took it to a preschool, and I showed it to some kids there. And I could see how much they loved it. I realized it was something really special. It was a huge show in the United States. Bigger, really, in its day than any other kid show that's on right now.
Today, Thomas and Friends is made with computers rather than a live-action model railway. This means that the stories and adventures can have more scope and become even bigger.
So we're currently working on season 19 of Thomas and Friends. From series 17 was where sort of Andrew Brenner and I then started really working together, where we were taking that CG story but trying to bring back some of the classic live action. We spend a lot of time on the phone, laughing, talking about story ideas, and we're kind of like the crew in the engine. He's the fireman sort of fueling the sort of firebox with lots of story ideas, and then I'm the driver taking that idea from the very start to the very end of the journey. Andrew and I will start talking, he'll start filling that blank sheet. We talk about the script, it then sort of evolves to sort of design of new characters, introduction of new characters. It's that teamwork that really goes to make the show such a great show.
Each year, a new series and movie are created. But this year is an extra special year for Thomas and his friends.
The big celebration for 2015 is the 70th anniversary of Thomas and Friends. From 1945, when the first book was published, to now, Thomas has sort of grown stronger and stronger, and we're celebrating those 70 years, and hopefully we'll be celebrating even more years to come. And this year, with the celebration, we've got a film called Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure.
I came across these images of this guy in a little sailboat that had been set up to be on rails, and I thought this little character of a sailboat on wheels would be such a nice way of having the sea and the railway come together. From those images, I started to find a way into this story that became the Legend of the Lost Treasure.
Hit Entertainment works with the innovative animation team at ARC Studios in Toronto to create everything that you see on screen, bringing all the characters and stories to life.
Well, animation is quite a long, involved process.
On a special, I believe it's about 60 people. On both special and episodes, it can be more than 100.
We start with a script. It's the first chance you get to visualize the story. Design departments working on the new characters, the new locations. The characters are brought to life by the animators.
When you see the whole puzzle done, it's incredible. People should understand how much effort and work stands behind the production.
Every day you're looking at someone else's contribution. It's just very humbling seeing how passionate people feel about their work.
When it comes to Skiff, we knew it's a small, tiny sailboat. Quite optimistic, quite shaky, but brave. So we knew his character and attitude. You can see that we dug up some pictures of these little sailboats. When we know about the boat itself, then it comes the character. Usually we start with sketching a few faces, different proportions, different eyes, sizes and noses and stuff, so we can come up with the final face. And then when you go downstairs, we have a screening room when everything is lit and rendered, and it's always a miracle. It's the best moment when you just sketch that thing and now it's all alive and in color and light, and it's talking.
I'm going as fast as a real engine now! Not yet, you're not, Skip.
We're celebrating the 70th anniversary with a great new film called Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure. And we thought, what better way to do that than to have a great song at the end of the film that really celebrates friendship. So we decided to put on a competition to find the best school choir to come in and sing that song for us. And we've been working closely with the National Schools Partnership and the composer Robert Hartshorn to find that winning entry.
We also went to Prague to record with the Prague Philharmonic Orchestra. Ultimately, it's just another epic film for Thomas.
There's no such thing as writing music for children. Children can accept a really wide range of music, and so there is only good music. The chance to actually record with an orchestra is great. The actual quality and power of the sound you get makes a huge difference.
The station master's family were having breakfast. There was a crash. The house rocked. Broken glass tinkled. Plaster peppered their plates. Thomas had collected a bush on his travels. He peered anxiously into the room through its leaves. The station master grimly strode out and shut off steam. His wife picked up her plate. "You miserable engine," she scolded. "Just look what you've done to our breakfast. Now I shall have to cook some more." She banged the door. More plaster fell. This time it fell on Thomas.
I had a model railway and I used to play with that for ages. When I first saw Thomas on television, to me that was the best model railway ever. And it was so beautifully set up. And I think that interest in model worlds and model railways is something that does persist.
As well as watching Thomas, kids can also play with Thomas and his friends, reliving the imaginative adventures they've seen on the screen. Just like the animation, a lot of work goes into designing and building the Thomas products before they make it into stores.
Fisher-Price is located in New York City, and this is where we handle all of the Thomas toy products.
All the designers here, we know a lot about the brand. We're constantly watching episodes and reading scripts. We wouldn't really seem like tourists on the island of Sodor.
I work here as a product designer for Thomas die-cast products. So I design all of the play sets and the die-cast engines. We pretty much make magic with toys. We start with nothing, and we do drawings and we make models and we turn those into real physical toys that kids can have tons of fun with. There's a ton of work that has to be done, and it spans across the globe, all the way from drawing initial ideas and holding brainstorms to actually planning out the assembly line to make these toys. So this is our final version of Samson in our die-cast line. And before we get to the final product, we have to go through a series of prototypes. The one just before this is an engineering prototype, and you can see it has some funny colors on it. But we're just testing out to make sure that all the parts fit properly. Before this, we have a prototype stage, and this isn't made of the real material, but this is just so we can do our review and make sure that Samson looks like Samson. Before that, our models are actually done in the computer, and we model the character and look at it just on computer screen for a digital review.
I have 9 nieces and nephews, and they're all so very different. So just hanging out with them, I can get a different idea every time I see them. I think I get most of my inspiration from the kids themselves.
My real introduction was when my little boy was born, and he came home from a party clinging on to a little toy train, which was Thomas. So very much of me working on the show is kind of to please him and his love of Thomas. The fact that so many children around the world love Thomas so much is great.
Thomas and Friends can now be seen in over 120 countries and in 20 different languages.
I want to go places and do things. I want to
see the world. But what does the show mean to fans old and new?
I'm married, guys, and I'm 6 years old. I'm having a birthday party with my twin brother named Drake Cox. Attaboy! I like going on choo-choo trains. My train crashed. Wait, I need some tools over here. Nene.
Thomas 玩过。我跟我妈妈、爸爸一块玩 Thomas 看电影。我長大後，我想設計 Thomas 嘅玩具。我嘅車係藍色，嗰件衫都係藍色。佢係第一個嘅，佢咧係醒目嘅，佢係第一個嘅 number。佢咧佢係好聰明嘅。
My name is Ashika. I went to school in England just for a year when I was about 8, and that's when I got my first rucksack, which was a Thomas the Tank Engine rucksack. But I think it was the red and the blue that got me interested in it. So then I went and got a book, and I was completely obsessed with it from then onwards. That was really popular because I had the red and the blue rucksack. It's probably quite a silly thing to remember, but that's what I remember.
المحطة القادمة هي مدينة دبي للإنترنت.
I am Avalon Joy S. Jimenez and I'm 10 years old and I was from Philippines and right now I'm living in Dubai, UAE.
We first started with the season 1 and we've been watching it. It's pretty nice. We also try to copy it
in a tree.
Yeah. Like choo choo.
He does it, not me.
My name's Imre, and I live in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. The first time I heard of Thomas and Friends was when I got a DVD for my birthday, and it was the one where James crashes and Thomas has to help. Then I finished the DVD, and then I would go up to my room and just build a layout, and just narrate it. Thomas and Friends just made my life a lot more awesome.
私の名前は伊藤仁と言います。私がトーマスサンドで働き始めたのは6年ほど前。きっかけはやはり子供と接するのがとても大好きで、子供と一緒にさっき乗って楽しかったって言って、また何回も乗りに来てくれる子供がいることはとても嬉しいことですし、また帰り際に楽しかったって言って笑顔で帰られる子供もいるんですけども、やっぱり帰りたくないって言って泣いてダダをこねて、そういう泣き顔を見るとやっぱ本当に楽しんでくれたのかな、そういう姿を見るのがとても嬉しいですね。
I'm really just starting, breaking away a little time to work on this from all of my other projects. Oh, I saw Thomas the Tank Engine at a train show in Guadalajara. I always thought that locomotives have a personality, and here the personality was made into a face. So I began to think more personally about the models that I built. The kids relate more to the face than anything else, and then they gradually get into the rest of the train. Here's this thing, this is the year of the steam engines, and they were really loud, chugging along, lots of smoke and loud noise and so forth, but later on they became sort of symbols of movement.
I'm Ryan Hagan, I'm the head administrator of Solar Island Forums. Solar Island Forums was established in 2002, and since then it's pretty much ballooned into becoming like the biggest mecca for Thomas fans on the internet. There was times as a 3-year-old I was saying to my parents I want to go to the island of Sodor, I want to go and visit Thomas. I've spent many a wonderful summer and spring walking those track beds, looking around those railways, but the one thing that I will always take and will always be with me is the friends that I've made through it. I don't know what path my life would have took if I hadn't been part of Solar Island Forums, because I've met so many amazing people who have become among my closest friends in life.
You're not just a little steam tram, Toby. There's nothing you can't do.
I've already told him that.
Welcome to the making of Thomas the Tank at Let Them Eat Cake. Come through. 2 weeks ago, I had a phone call and asked whether I'd like to make Thomas the Tank, 3.3 metres by 1.5 by 1.2 metres, and doing something on that scale, huge. I don't think people understand how big this cake is really going to be. We started with some plans first, and then we got them all made to scale, and then from there we went to ordering all the stuff in the icing, the butter, the sugar, the flour, the trays, how much baking time we were going to need, all of these things. We've already had 40 boxes of eggs come in, and I'm getting another 30 boxes of eggs just to make sure that we've got enough cake. Bags of flour, cocoa powder, there's just so much.
All aboard! I'll get you there on time.
There is a huge train culture, and I think any fan of Thomas and Friends, I would suggest if you haven't been to a real steam railway, go, because it's just fascinating.
We have celebrated Thomas with a Day Out with Thomas event for the past 13 years. And it's an awesome experience because not only do the kids get to ride behind the real Thomas, but they also get to see Thomas talking.
The Day Out with Thomas event is very special. It's an opportunity to see multi-generational families come. And that's important for the future of railroading. When kids come, Thomas is really the first exposure a lot of them have with trains, and that passion that they have grows with them.
It's been a great experience for us, and it also continues to make that connection with Thomas so powerful. Thomas is the rock star for preschoolers. When you see a group of preschoolers screaming like it's the Beatles, that's really special.
When we see families, we see little ones, we see moms, we see dads, as well as grandparents, and they all have some experience with Thomas and with real locomotives. So it's extremely important that we keep the young people involved, and Thomas is an excellent way to introduce them to trains that will carry with them for the rest of their lives.
Thomas felt depressed The plaster was tickly. He wanted to sneeze, but he didn't dare in case the house fell on him. At last the workmen propped up the house, and Donald and Douglas, puffing hard, managed to haul Thomas back to the yard. He looked comic. "You're a very naughty engine." "I know, sir. I'm sorry, sir." Thomas's voice was muffled behind his bush. "You must go to the works and have your front end mended. It'll be a long job." Yes, sir," faltered Thomas. "Meanwhile, a diesel rail car will do your work." A diesel, sir?" "Yes, Thomas. Diesels always stay in their sheds until they're wanted. Diesels never gallivant off to breakfast in station masters' houses." And the Fat Controller turned on his heel and sternly walked away.
Thomas and Friends is loved and cherished by generations of people from all around the world. And even after 70 years, Thomas still continues to delight his fans and is travelling on into the future at full steam.
I think it's important that as Thomas continues, we need to remember where he came from and keep him close to that. There was a certain spirit in the Reverend Audrey stories, which I feel is what's made Thomas very strong.
Thomas and Friends has been around for 70 years, but they didn't just take one thing and do it for 70 years. They're constantly evolving. It started as books, and then it was models that they turned into a TV show, and now we're doing the 3D animation. And we're not going to stop there. Thomas is going to continue to evolve.
When you really look at what has changed, it's not a lot. I mean, stylistically, we've changed things a little bit, but Thomas is always going to go on adventures. And I think as long as he's always speaking the language of the current kids, he'll continue to have appeal.
I would honestly say the main overarching moral, which transcends the books, the TV series, is strive to do your best. I mean, you might not get there right away, but if you work hard and if you always do your best and you're honourable, you will get there in the end.
To learn and grow. Do another mistake, learn and grow again.
Don't worry, Toby. Try again. You can do it.
It helps you, like, take care of your friends, and it helps you be nice. Oh, not too tight.
And another lesson I really like is there is always a way. You could always find the way in anything.
Teamwork is definitely part of it, you know, not being too boastful.
It's old-fashioned values that just rely on family.
Thomas is a nice train, that's why I love him.
Everybody can make a contribution to make things better or to do something, and I think in Thomas that's represented in the words being really useful, but it just means being helpful. And I think very related to it and very important is an understanding of friendship and relationships. You have a big cast of characters, and all of those characters have times where it's difficult for them to relate to each other, and they need to help each other and work through those things. And I feel like that's always been part of the show.
I don't think that Thomas is going to stop soon. I think Series 19, I think we'll be going way past 25. I hope, because I love it and I carry on for as long as they need me.
Full steam ahead!
Full steam ahead, sir!
We make a team together. 1, 2, 3. We go full steam together. Him, you, me. Best of friends forever we'll be. Yeah, yeah. Better together. We need our friends nearby us every day, so they can help and guide us every way. And we know there's a place they will stay. Yeah, yeah. Forever beside us. Well, there's nothing that I couldn't do when I'm steaming along next to you.
Hello, Thomas! Hey, Skip! Hey, look, I've got my own line now, just like you!